This now brings us to the last session for the day, before we break for lunch. In order for businesses to prosper in a world plagued with poverty, inequality, violence, and environmental stress, it is essential for companies to align their CSR practices now with global development priorities and work towards achieving sustainable development goals. Our next session, Sustainable Development Goals, Are We Thinking of the Future?, is going to discuss convergence of sustainable development goals with companies' CSR agenda and how the two can be linked together. For this session, I'm going to invite on stage Aloka Majumdar, Head Corporate Sustainability from HSBC. Santosh Jayaram, Partner and Head Sustainability and CSR Advisory, KPMG, who's going to moderate this session for us. Mr. Ashok Pamadi, CEO, NASSCOM Foundation. And we have Mr. Shiva Bebarta, ED, UBS Business Solutions, who's also going to be joining the panel today and sharing his views.
Good afternoon. So I think we are the people who are going to be from now to in between, I think, the lunch. So let's get into the act pretty fast. Thank you all, first of all, to be here. This session, what we are going to discuss is about the linkages of the Sustainable Development Goals and the CSR agendas, or especially the role of the companies that can play in the SDGs. I'll just give a small snapshot before I kind of venture into asking some of the questions and their thoughts into it, is that the predecessor of the Sustainable Development Goals, the Millennium Development Goals, and the big shift which happened between the MDGs and the SDGs is the explicit call to the private sector or to the companies to participate in the journey. MDGs never invited the private sector to participate. It was mostly a government-led thing. And then we have now the SDGs where there is this call. So we understand that the private sector has a big role to play in achieving these goals, which are set for 2030. And especially in India, it is going to be one of the critical ones, because I was talking to some of the people in the United Nations, and what they mentioned is that if India achieves the SDGs, the world would have reached half of the SDGs. So it's us on the half, and the rest of the world is the half. And that's how India's role is going to be in the Sustainable Development Goal journey. I didn't count the exact number of days left for achieving those goals. I think it's around 4,000 more days. So that's it. So we are kind of running short of time in terms of how we are going to get into that particular thing. One of the things which we also look into is that, when we say, okay, you have called the companies to participate in the SDGs, but how can they participate? And I think that's where I would start the discussions with all of you, is that when we look at it from a consultant's viewpoint in terms of how companies can contribute to the SDGs, we see three approaches or three pillars in which the companies can contribute. One is through their core operations. Whatever you are doing, whatever you are producing, or whatever you are kind of doing the services, that the way you are doing it itself can contribute to the SDGs. Because any organization uses air and water, any organization uses people. So, the right kind of employment, the right kind of utilization of resources, all those kind of things will contribute to the SDGs. So the core operations by which you can do that. The second one is what we call as a shared value approach, where the companies can kind of benefit, the community can benefit, so there can be new kinds of products and services which you can roll out. You can have some public-private partnerships with the government and some of those kind of things. So that's another angle through which you can attend to the SDGs. The third one is a pure philanthropy route, or the Schedule 7 or the CSR, what we call. That can be the route through which you can do that. So I would start by that, and maybe I will start with you, Aloka, is in terms of how do you think this three-pillared approach is, does that fit into the way HSBC sees the things? And I know that HSBC has some global targets also around SDGs. You have put together a governance structure right from the global level, even at the India level, how you will be attending to some of the SDGs. Would like to hear start from you.
Sure. So thank you, Santosh. You know, it's an important thing because I'm representing an international organization, and there has been, I have seen actually over the last 9 years that I've been with the organization, how actually this entire space has evolved. For HSBC, as Santosh mentioned, we have actually looked at the structure of the function that I belong to. So way back in 2012, HSBC actually structured a function, which is a separate function within the company called corporate sustainability. And it is, so corporate sustainability is, why I'm emphasizing it, is exactly to do with the goals that we are talking about and the goals that we have set for the company. So the way we are structured is we look at primarily 4 things. One, of course, is the CSR grants for the company. And within HSBC in India, you have the bank and you have several other group companies also, which are data processing companies, IT companies, which are also pretty large. So that's taking care of the CSR grants for the company. The second is something called sustainable operations. And we have a very large program called Reduce, which was again launched in 2012. And it's a very long program, it's an 8-year program, where we have very stringent targets for us to reduce waste, water, energy, and also, you know, curb travel. So we have a very, very large target on that. The target is actually for you know, we've actually done a math in terms of per employee's carbon emission, and we've set a target that by 2020 we are going to reduce it to below 2%. Below 2 for every employee. So that is something that we are working on. So that is sustainable operations. And operations also has a very large focus as well on the premises that we operate from across the globe. So that's another one. The third is something which is completely common, or you can say a big target when it comes to shared value. We have a huge focus on sustainable finance. We are a bank, and we definitely think that while you can have philanthropic support to environmental sustainability, but I think we have come at a stage now where financial institutions across the world will have to look at it as a way of doing business, because that's where your next growth is coming. So sustainable finance is a very large focus for us. And the last is something called sustainable risk. Now, when you're a bank, you naturally think of risks, right? So it's extremely important that we also look at risks across these 3 things. When we are talking about CSR, and that maybe I'll tackle later, but in terms of, you know, particularly when it comes to philanthropy, we never talk about risks. And that's something also we are looking at in a very, very big manner. So I'll stop with that. And
Thank you, Aloka. I think, Shiva, I would come to you now. I know that you have a particular focus on education, skilling, and some of those areas, which is kind of a pillar stone to achieve many of those SDGs. I mean, that kind of cross cuts into multiple of all these 17 SDGs as well. So how do you plan the whole thing, and what would be the kind of things which you are seeing currently as to you know, if I gave you a bigger picture of how India is looking at it. I mean, we have to achieve these goals. It's kind of big. So how do you think this whole space will?
Sure, thank you. I think that's an interesting question. UBS as a firm, as a bank, has been in existence for 150 years, whereas the India presence has been there for the last 10 years. And especially, like Aloka mentioned, we've got multiple units. We've got the front office and we've got the shared service centers as well. Now, in terms of the global approach, what we do is in terms of the SDG goals in 2 particular themes are education and entrepreneurship are 2 areas we see, which is in the list of 15 things are 2 of the key parameters. If you make a marked improvement in those, you'll see a sustainable change happening as well. So what we have is globally, we have what is called as the Optimus Foundation, and being one of the largest wealth management firms in the world, a large percentage of our interaction with our clients, etc., is in terms of how do we jointly make an impact. And that's where the Optimus Foundation was formed, in terms of ensuring that we drive towards sustainable goals and partner with our clients across the regions. And a major portion of the Optimus Foundation initiatives and the projects also catered in the Indian subcontinent region as well, given that this is actually the amphitheater of where most of the action and the development needle can make a large impact. So that's one aspect in terms of the Optimus Foundation trying to partner with our clients and ensuring that the kind of funds they generate and are willing to invest in certain of these goals and initiatives happen, especially in the regions like Jharkhand, Odisha, Rajasthan, etc., some of the areas where we do a lot of grassroots related works in these two themes. The other area is especially in terms of employee volunteering, etc. So just yesterday we released our Asia Pacific employee volunteering CSR statistics, and I'm happy to say that in the last 3-4 years of operations, I think India has taken the #1 lead in APAC in terms of making a sustainable impact in terms of employees coming forward and volunteering in these two key themes. The third aspect is in terms of how do you create an impact in the environment. So all our buildings which we are setting up are all LEED Platinum certified, which actually meet the highest standards of environmental standards and safety as well, and we take a lot of conscious decision in terms of how do we sustain this over a period of time as well. So these are small but impactful steps we are taking from an India perspective, given that we have not been in India for a long time as compared to some of our other banking peers, and on a global level that's how the Optimus as well as the local India teams are participating and creating that sustainable change.
Sure. Sure. So, Ashok, so just before I come to you, I need to kind of check with these two people. One more thing is that we publish every year what is called as the CSR reporting survey, where we analyze the top 100 companies in India. The reason why we limit it to the top 100 is this top 100 contributes to about 56% of the overall CSR budget. So it gives a kind of a good thing. One of the things which we also look into, a small chapter, is the CSR and the SDGs. And an interesting number which comes out over there is that of the top 100 companies, only 3 of them mention SDG in their CSR policy. And, but 32 of them report, when the annual report is published, they refer SDG. So what do you think? I mean, is this something which need to be more integrated, more this thing, or?
So I'll take it first. So a very interesting question actually, Santosh. We have had our fair share of challenges, and so has our partners. See, when you talk about SDGs, it's very quantitative in terms of what you need to capture. And that is something when it comes to both the CSR person who's working at the corporate end as well as at the NGO end, we are not really sitting to figure out that how we measure the impact and what is the kind of things that we need to capture. And that's an exercise I'll be honest, we've done it much later, but that's something now we are now trying to mainstream it in their thinking. And what's interesting is that these parameters are something that some of those are interesting parameters which has helped the organizations or the implementation NGO actually to capture their impact in a much more quantitative and qualitative. I mean, being very specific with your quantitative outcomes as well as your qualitative outcomes, that's kind of helped. So, but I think that was the first challenge in terms of how we define, and we first get to understand that how we are achieving these goals that has been set under SDGs. Once we have done that, I think it's working well. When I speak with my peers in the sector, I get kind of a mixed reaction. You're right, most of the programs that are run or being supported by organizations, almost everything is being, contributing to SDGs, but how we capture it is something which is a challenge, and perhaps there needs to be one organization or a group of organizations who can work like you to actually capture and make it much more easily communicated to the larger stakeholder in the CSR space.
Okay.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with Aloka as well, given that they have a larger tenure and presence in India as compared to us. We are also at the drawing stage in terms of understanding what percentage of the work is actually contributing to the SDG goals.
But one thing which I noticed when you said about the states where you're working, in India, when you look at where the SDGs are a challenge, you are working in some of the states. We have identified 5 states. If they move the needle up, we are there to achieve the SDGs. And some of the states which you mentioned are in that list.
Yes. So I think that's where we are trying to make the small but tangible kind of impact. Like I said, it's just 3 years we've started off this kind of work. We're partnering with NGOs, we're looking at opportunities, and like Alok also mentioned, it's too early to say how do I bucketize or classify them into the SDC goals, but we're trying to make that impact as well as the honest confession as well.
Right. So I think, Ashok, coming to you, because we specifically asked him to come and sit here. The reason is that we also wanted the the bigger association to think about some of the things around SDGs. As Alok also mentioned, that there is a need for somebody to kind of look at it from an industry perspective and all those things. Can I phrase like IT for SDGs? It's a bigger agenda. Many of you, the clients of your members, have these goals around the SDGs, and there would be quite a number of business opportunities as well, and plus it is a good thing to look into. Do you think that as NASSCOM foundations and some of these people, there is a opportunity for you to get into some of these things, and maybe you can share some of the your own members, what they are doing in this space as well?
Yeah, sure. Santosh, when you look at all these 17 SDGs, it'll be very surprising to know that if I take the overall IT industry, like 2,700 odd member companies, it's interesting that we do clearly see that practically all of them are actually playing somewhere or the other. It's not that all of them will be there in all the 17.
Yeah.
Top ones are very easily covered. But what is very interesting is that we believe that IT is no more a part of a separate entity per se, because IT is business and business is IT, okay, for many companies. The first aspect. The second aspect is when we are talking about a very disruptive world, IT is here to stay as mainstream, right? And our own theme is, what we call it as tech for good. And when we talk for tech for good, we are clearly seeing that member companies are using their CSR funds for making impact on some of these SDGs, okay? So let me give you some example. You take an example of health industries, for example. So members like a Philips, Siemens, GE Health, right? Or even sometimes even our own other traditional IT firms like a Wipro or Infosys and all. What they're doing is they are getting into social innovation, right? And when they're getting into social innovations, they're actually nurturing startups in the health tech field, right? It's a classic example, and we believe a country like India, where primary health, at least practically 70 to 80% of the funds today are going for skilling for employability. But when you look at health, for example, we don't see not much of activity happening, and we believe a digital intervention can make a huge impact on primary health. Leave alone the secondary and tertiary, because it requires specialization. Sure. So that is already happening. Okay, just to give an example. Second is an environment. You look at it, right? And then we know that environment is a challenge. Pollution, for example, is a problem in our NCR region, or now I think it's almost coming into Bangalore and other location. And you'll be surprised when we're talking about the lakes burning in Bangalore, for example. A lot of support is actually coming in from the IT BPM firms to see how exactly can they look at it and trying to say technology interventions in trying to ensure that they don't have further hazards of fire. One more example which we are very proud to talk about is the Haryana Vision Zero. It's a road safety, right? Now when we took the project, it was not so much of technology interventions, frankly speaking. But then we saw that we were able to save lives, about 182 lives or something like that has got saved in 10 districts. Now we firmly believe with the technology interventions, we can impact a lot more states and a lot more districts of Haryana itself, wherein road safety can be an important area, an SDG, right? We can play a big role. So this tech for good, I think I'll use your word. He said beautifully, he said good IT and IT for good. And IT is for good is what we all talk about. We call it a tech for good. And I think if we utilize these CSR funds effectively, some could be the core, some may be philanthropic, some may be shared, right? It will have a huge impact, and we are clearly seeing that members are very open, and as long as it is making use of IT, and irrespective of whether it's core or whether it's shared or it is philanthropic, they're all game for it. And organizations like ourselves, because we use NASSCOM name, and we are basically a conglomeration of competitors, we believe that we can make a big impact in all the SDGs what you were talking about.
Sure, thank you. So the next phase, what I wanted to take the discussion is also a very important challenge inside the SDGs itself. You have the 17 goals, and if you look at the top 11, those are socio-economic in nature. And if you're going to proceed on the first 11 goals, and you are making progress in that, what it is going to do is having an impact on the bottom ones. Because the consumption patterns will go up, the productions will go up, and all those kind of things, because the socio-economic situations are improving. So when you plan some of these kind of projects and some of these kind of things, do you really look at balancing or kind of try to negate the negative impacts which a project can create? So when you design a particular project, do you look into, yes, there will be, you are designing that project for a positive impact, that's very clear, but it will have some negative impacts as well. But how do you negate that? You talked about something about risk, but can you just explain a little more on that?
So when it comes to creating a program, and that's becoming more and more important in the coming days, we, from the company's perspective, we are actually focusing on something called risk of failure. Because typically what happens is when you get into a CSR meeting, everybody is talking about the numbers that you're reaching out and the impact one is having, everything is positive impact. So that in itself, I think, is something that within HSBC we are trying to change, because the fact is there is risk in everything. When you're putting in money, when you're doing it, we need to figure that out. So that's one thing that we are looking at. You are talking about even a step ahead of it, actually looking at impact that can be negative because of the intervention. I'll be honest, Santosh, we have not looked at when it comes to philanthropic program or CSR programs. It's a very good idea. I would definitely take it and see that we look at it with our partners. Currently, we of course look at purely in terms of the risks associated with the implementation of a program, and we work very closely with our partners. And just to give you an idea, HSBC works with 60 NGOs across the country, directly and indirectly over 100 NGOs. So that's, we're talking about a very large number. Some of our partners are in the room as well. And it's a constant conversation that it's difficult to have conversation with such a large stakeholder base, but we really are taking this seriously, at least at the project level, to figure out that we definitely define that there are risks associated with that own thing. When it comes to, because you spoke about impact, I think the big impact we're talking about is impact from the projects that we lend to. The big focus for HSBC, and that comes from your shared value discussion, HSBC therefore is pushing a lot of sustainable finance. We've made a very large commitment of $100 billion by 2025, where we want to put it in sustainable finance. It sounds very good, but it's a big challenge for the institution. And that's where what we want to see is that the projects that we are supporting, particularly large-scale projects, we are very specific in terms of that it has to clear the sustainable risks that's been put in place by the company. We have about 8 such risks which we've created internally, which includes forestry, defense, water, fresh water, agriculture. So these are things that we've created internally to ensure that the impact is, the negative impact it can have, and how we look at neutralizing that. So that's one. And of course, overall, for the banking sector as a whole, you have the Equator Principle globally. That's something, we're the first signatory organization. So, but it is serious business. I think where we are moving when it comes to SDGs is that it's a very serious consideration, not just from the philanthropic side, but also the business side for us. But to take your point, I'm going to take the negative impact of any program, or it can have some negative thing in my next round of discussion with partners.
Sure. The scale of a corporate getting involved in some of these things, you cannot have a big scale in comparison with the government. I mean, look at the Ayushman Bharat or some of those kind of mega projects. You cannot have that. And today there is a kind of a tendency in India that everything can be solved using CSR, which is kind of a myth, because it will not. So scale is not something which is for the corporates. But then new ways of doing it, efficiency of doing this, these are some of the things through which the corporate can look at creating an impact. So can you share some examples or something like that?
No, sure, interesting question. Very recently we tried up with an NGO called Pratham to basically create what is called as a financial literacy program for kids, especially the school-going kids. And what we're doing is in phase 1, this application which is basically introducing school-going kids, especially to the basic concepts of financial literacy through gamification and digitization, is something we thought will appeal much more in this data-driven age rather than just go into a classroom and draw a piece of things on a blackboard. So what we have done is we're launching this gamification of this app along with Pratham in most likely in March. And what this will do is we'll initially target the state of Maharashtra to look at all the government schools and try to see how do we basically roll out financial literacy, because like you said, the change has to happen at the grassroots level and at some point at the level which will make an impact. So if you make these kids who are going to be the future citizens of India or the future workers of India in the workplace tomorrow financially literate at a very young age, it actually empowers them to think much more effectively as compared to not knowing what are the basic things from a financial literacy. That's one aspect as well. Second thing is we also tied up with a number of schools in terms of digitizing the education medium, using gamification and using digital tools to make classrooms interesting. And what we have seen is in some of the small areas we have worked in, the attendance ratio in some of the schools has also increased a large amount, and that is also creating that impact in terms of, which is a core theme, is education and entrepreneurship as well. So sure, those are small but sustainable things. And the third part is whether we have assessed the negative impact. Like I said, I'll take that back and check with our team, because while we have a very, very thorough due diligence team which looks at all our proposals and projects, I think that's something also, like Aloka mentioned, is something we need to go back and check and come back.
So you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to, when we talk about scale today, and that's a discussion in most of the boardrooms of corporates, scale can be, at least we've come to this in terms of what we can look at scale. One is we can look at geography and do deep dive. That's one way of looking at scale. There is another where we reach out to various geographies, that's looking like scale, and we have the Skills for Life program, which we work very closely with you, as well as in the morning session, we had Swadesh Foundation as well, which is one of our partners in our Skills for Life program. So one is reaching out to various geographies. The other thing is also having create a model which can be replicated by others. That also is scale, because if you're able to even say that this is a model that I've created and this is something that's being taken by several other local organizations, that's being seen. So there are, I think we have to, the scale fortunately can be defined in various ways in this sector, and that's something. And what Shiva mentioned is a very important point. Say Shiva is working with Pratham. I'm sure NASSCOM Foundation will have various projects with Pratham. We have, and various people in this room, my CSR colleagues will also have Pratham. The other thing which is missing currently is that corporates are not talking to each other, which needs to, it started, I'm not saying it's not started, but I think the next big partnership will be corporate partnership. Because we always have programs which are funded by various corporates, but we are not talking to each other, because that will give a huge confidence to the NGO, which is also has this huge tension of raising funds, right? I mean, that's the biggest tension for any not-for-profit. And we know to move from one project to another and to raise funds is a really, really difficult task. But if there can be projects that have been created with, say, 3 or 4 like-minded corporates to come together and fund it, that's also one way of looking at scale.
So the moment he partnerships, he started.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about it. This is a forum, for example. And why we are doing it is basically to ensure that there is partnership. Right? We have, I think, 50% NGOs, 50% corporates out here. And that's precisely what we are aiming to, is to ensure that we have a shared vision, a shared value. And if, both the people out here sitting next to me are big giants, right? And their pockets are deep. But we do have many of them, where they have small budgets in CSR. And if you have a shared vision, it's possible for us to scale. Because when you look at scaling, it's basically looking at depth as well as breadth. And just before this panel, we had some interesting panels where they're talking about future of jobs and future of skills, and those are the topics. Because the whole approach is in a disruptive field or arena we are in, it's very, very important and imperative that our CSR initiatives stay relevant and it is futuristic. Sure. Because we can't be saying that I do this job, this activity because there's employability assured. That's great, but how long will the employability be there?
Yeah.
Example in IT industry itself. If somebody is training on data entry, I would say, guys, watch out. How long do you think the RPAs will not take over? And from RPA, how long will it not take over the AI aspects, right? Those are some of the things which one has to ask and say that, look, I am getting job for 3,000 people on disability. It doesn't really help.
Yeah.
Because after that, after 1 year, 2 years, or maybe shortly, they will be jobless.
Yeah.
Right? And where's the CSR funding coming from? Right? It only helps in only employability, not in reskilling. So these are some major aspects. One, corporates have to look at it and be very relevant for not only the current situation, but a little bit futuristic.
Yeah.
And I think CSR has to be, and that's why we talk about social innovation, skilling for the future, because that makes relevance.
Yes.
Right? Because you're really looking at future.
Yeah.
And I firmly believe that we don't have to really look at too much of the current problems we have. Because the current problems, like you talk about SDGs, right? Some of them are slightly futuristic.
Yeah.
And we got to be futuristic. Otherwise, CSR is not meeting the objectives.
Thank you. I think we are in the same week of Davos, and my first messages which are coming out is a grey outlook into the future, and some of the skilling programs, many of you would be doing it. The applicability of those skilling programs and the employabilities would be something to watch for in the future. Thank you very much. So I think I'm going to stop there. I have 7 more minutes to go as per the clock. I'm opening the session for some of the questions. Let it be a question, please, and introduce yourself, to whom that question is, please, and then make it a short question. And of course, this I repeat in a couple of sessions. If the person who is answering starts by answering saying that it's a good question, you should be satisfied with whatever answer you get. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, the gentleman on the pink shirt.
Hi, Venkat Rola. This is to
I'm the moderator.
Yes, I can ask the moderator also. Okay, and Ashok, of course. Talking of what Aloka said, partnerships amongst CSR. There is a great need for MSMEs to do their part of the CSR, but it's like fragmented farming.
Yeah.
So, is there any way guys like you can bring clusters of pools of resources from these MSMEs, like-minded ones, and create CSR programs for them?
Okay. I mean, so I will start, but in any case, you have some comments on it. There has been many trials which has been done. So it is not that people have not tried. So let me put
We've tried through CIA also.
Yeah. So there has been many trials. One of the biggest challenges which never get addressed is that anybody who is doing CSR, let's look at it. I mean, corporate is a separate entity, NGOs are a separate entity, and I keep on saying is that, I'm not making it this thing, but the corporate runs on numbers and it's more from here, whereas the NGOs run on passion and it's more from here. These are two very distinct kind of things. The challenge is that when the corporate is entering into a CSR, they also look at some value enhancement from a brand reputation and all those things, whether it is MSME or whomsoever it is, so whomsoever is doing it. The challenge is when you are pooling into the resources, the traceability of what individually each one of them are doing gets lost. If somebody can crack that code, then pooling becomes very interesting.
I think they need a report at the end of the year. That can be done.
It's not easy. Many people have tried it out. So I think if you have any comments.
So I would say that from the NASSCOM Foundation's perspective, 80% of our members overall of NASSCOM are SMEs, by the way. Only 20% are the big ones. So that is good and bad news, because the 80% of them don't fall under the purview of CSR, frankly, because they are small. But having said that, we believe that there is a philanthropy, and we are clearly looking at them as volunteers, frankly speaking. And we are the number one in the Self-First Society, for example, and a huge number of them are in the SME. So the volunteering activity is where they are getting involved, and that's something which I think is going on in a big way. The other one is the shared one, which he said we have tried somewhere in some regions successful, some regions not successful, because it's basically It is philanthropy, number one. And the second aspect is that when you look at SMEs, it also becomes the affordability aspects also comes in, because there is a little bit of funding which is required to sustain a program. Sustainability is also another important aspect. So I would say that we still have a long way. As far as SME, we have not cracked the code, so to speak, as to how to make SMEs come into the mainstream of CSR. But volunteering is some activity which we find that it gels well with majority of them, including their employees.
Any other questions? Yes?
Rupa here. So my question is, interestingly, when I look at IT space and how they're funding CSR, most of the CSR funding is in and around their offices because employee volunteering is key. How do you think NASSCOM as a body can ensure that to achieve these SGD goals, we get this funding also diverted to Orissa, Jharkhand and places where we do not see a lot of IT presence?
So, as per the act, it has to be in that particular state, right? That is the main thing. So, let's say SAP example, okay, I can tell you, because they are very keen, but they are not allowed to go beyond Karnataka because they spend a lot of funds on CSR, but they're not able to go beyond Karnataka because of that. So wherever they have, there is a thing because, sorry.
Okay, yeah, let's hear him out.
Yeah.
We'll discuss
so there is one thing, but having said that, the other aspect when it comes to volunteering, which I said, right, we have seen the best programs are done after the program is implemented through an NGO, when we have the employees also contributing to the CSR endeavor, that program is extremely successful. We have got data to prove to that. A recent example, or IBM for example, Microsoft with another example, where we are seeing that because of the fantastic volunteering efforts by the individual companies, we have had success. Now what happens is, and here when he talked about core operations and all those aspects, those comes in. Because when you look at Northeast, for example, we have tried. NDLM, for example, we have the NDLM centers in 16 states, which I mentioned in the morning. But we can't take the other, big data analytics, for example, to Orissa, right? In Orissa, for example, I know Mindtree is working on accessibility. They do that. Okay, we also have some centers there. But beyond that, we are not able to go because we have a challenge. Because it becomes very expensive to fly in those employees to go to Orissa because there is no setup there. So only those people who have got a setup are able to operate. And you know very well that IT BPM industry, 80% of the IT BPM industry are located in about 20 cities in the country.
Sure.
That's the data we have. And yes, it's sad, but it's a fact.
Yeah.
We cannot do much about it because without volunteers, we clearly see programs fail. So this one appeal I have, just don't give us checks to all the NGOs. Please get your employees involved. You see a huge success in that particular program.
So I think the data statistics in terms of the surveys, what we do also very clearly says is that we in the 2018 we have done the analysis on the aspirational districts which Government of India announced, and how much funding is going, CSR funding is going to the aspirational districts, very less. Let's be very clear on that. But I go back to what I said earlier. CSR is not the answer to solve the social issues of India. Okay. Second thing, CSR is a part in the Companies Act. Okay, and the Companies Act, it is not a separate legislation or something, it is one part of the Companies Act. And the Companies Act is very clearly looking at investors and some of those kind of areas where it very clearly mentions preferably in the local area. Yeah. Okay, so there is a very clear statement over there. So my question is that if, let us say, Maharashtra gets a bulk of the CSR funding, or some districts get the bulk of the CSR funding, why can't the government allocate better funding to some of the other places, taking it out from where the funding is happening? See, you cannot substitute the government missionaries using CSR. Let's be very open and frank. And on that note, I think zero comes in my table. Thank you all very much. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for such a fantastic panel. I want to request Ashok to please give a token of appreciation to our speakers. Yeah. The next session.